Good evening, everyone. I'm Doug Billy.
And I'm Laura Von Low. Our top story, running out of time.
An execution date is now on the books for convicted local killer Odell Barnes.
Welcome to TylerMedeirosTV. For those of you that are new, make sure you subscribe and turn on post notifications so you don't miss it when I upload. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the strangest last meal requests on death row. Now, for those of you who may not know what death row is, also known as condemned row, let me explain. In some states and countries around the world, they still have the death sentence in place, which means the judge allows the jury the option of a death penalty, where the convicted criminal will be executed, or an option of life in prison. Death row is the place in prison that houses inmates awaiting their execution date. Now, many places no longer have the death sentence in place, but many places still do. As of 2020, there is a total of 53 countries that still have the death penalty in effect, which can be death by hanging, shooting, lethal injection, beheading, or electrocution. There is also 25 states in the United States that still implement the death sentence to this day. Now, one thing that you may not know is that in many places, a day or two before the execution of the inmate is granted a last meal. Now, there's places where they just give you the usual prison food, but in many places, you're granted pretty much whatever you desire, of course, with some restrictions. Now, the man we're going to be talking about today is a man named Odell Barnes Jr., born March 22nd, 1968 in Wichita County, Texas. In the year 2000, Odell would be put to death for the murder of Helen Bass.
My name is Mike Charlton, and I'm one of three lawyers who represents Odell Barnes. Odell was convicted in Wichita Falls, Texas, for capital murder of a woman named Helen Bass. He'd known Helen Bass for a number of years. Helen was one of his mother's best friends. They both worked together at the Wichita Falls State Hospital and knew each other for many, many years. Over the years, Helen Bass had allowed Odell to come into her home a number of times. He worked on her home. He did a lot of repair work on her house. He was allowed to have parties in the barn that she had out there at her house, and they were good friends.
On the date of November 29th, 1989, Odell would attempt to rob Helen Bass's home, which would result in her death and the execution of Odell. Odell entered the home while Helen Bass was at work and began searching the house. Not long after Odell entered the home, Helen Bass returned to her home after work, and Odell was caught by surprise. Helen would then get robbed by Odell along as beaten and stabbed, but the fatal wound would be a gunshot to the head. It would be the evidence found at the scene that would lead officials to arrest Odell Barnes Jr. And upon arresting him, officials found him to be in possession of a .32 caliber pistol, which belonged to Helen Bass. Odell had a record already from a couple of robberies he committed and had been arrested for.
Odell was a person that they could blame this on and get away with it without doing a lot of extra work.
These individuals will engage in criminal conduct that is similar to an offense for which they're convicted or for which they're charged, and the police normally just operate in patterns. They find somebody who's a suspect in a similar case, and they think that if he's committing a similar crime, he's obviously good for the crime that they're investigating. They arrest him for that, and they leave it to the court system to sort all that out later.
Odell Barnes Jr. was appointed 2 local attorneys to defend his case, but had minimal budget to work with. So no true investigation on the defense side had been conducted. No forensic testing was done, and witness statements were made that neighbors saw Odell on the property of Helen Bass the day of the murder. After only 3 hours, the jury would come to the decision that Odell was guilty of the murder and would be sentenced to death.
A footprint that they claim belongs to Odell, but nobody can tell us where that print came from. And it's not something that was found in Mrs. Bass's home because it's a footprint on an official court document, which is, it doesn't make any sense why that would be in her home. What we think is what happened is that when Odell was arrested and taken to the Wichita County Jail, that a piece of paper was set on the floor and he was told to step on that paper in order to make a footprint impression.
He would then end up appealing the decision, and anti-death activists from Europe would donate a large sum of $16,000 towards his defense. Odell would also have 2 new attorneys appointed to defending him, who ended up paying for forensic testing to be done out of their own pocket. After the tests were conducted, the defense team noticed discrepancies in the forensic evidence, which they would label as serious errors. Odell had originally claimed he had never had sexual relations with Bass, even though his DNA would be found at the scene. Years after the trial, evidence would in fact prove that the bodily fluid found on Helen Bass was in fact from Odell, which at that point, Odell had confessed to him and Bass having pre-existing relations. But Odell was prompted by his first defense team to not tell the jury. Also in the trial, a lamp which they stated was brand new was used as evidence due to having Odell's fingerprints on it. The new defense team would uncover that the lamp was in fact not brand new and that Odell had visited the home of Bass in the time she had bought it. Forensic testing did show that the bloodstains found on Odell's clothing were in fact Bass's blood, but the blood had been very minimal, which was inconsistent with the brutal crime and the blood found at the scene. The blood on Odell's clothing also had unusual levels of citric acid, which is consistent with the practices used to preserve blood in forensic labs.
One of the items of evidence that was used to convict Odell was the presence of 2 small dots of blood on his coverall. Now, this is 2 very small dots of blood in a room where virtually everything else is covered with blood, the victim's blood.
Along with the defense's findings, witness statements were also found to be inconsistent. One statement saying that Odell was seen on the property 45 minutes after Helen Bass had already returned home. Odell Barnes would go on to be executed on March 1st, 2000. But before his execution, he was granted a last meal, which he requested justice, equality, and world peace. Now I want to know what you guys think down below in the comments, and if you had to choose one last meal, what would your choice be? But I'm going to go ahead and close out today's video here. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you did, give it a nice big thumbs up. I really do appreciate it. I want to thank you guys so much for all the love and support that you guys continuously give me. It means the world to me, and I will see you guys in my next video. Peace.